What's up, everyone? Matt here of the Lifestyle Practice, where together with my partners Derek and Steve, we help dentists like you all elevate your lives and careers through dental practice ownership. You know what we do. The main way we work together is through one-on-one coaching. But as you all know, we've got this podcast that you're listening to right now. We've got our TLP Academy. We've got our private Facebook group. We've got our mastermind groups that we launch from time to time. We've got all sorts of ways to help you all become better dentists and better business owners and how to create your very own lifestyle practices. So if you want to get involved, keep listening to this podcast, share it with a friend, drop a review on the Apple Podcast Store or something to help us grow. And obviously check us out at thelifestylepractice.com to learn more about everything that we offer. You can also reach out to me directly, Matt, at thelifestylepractice.com with any questions or anything you might need. So if you've been tuning in the last few times I've hosted the podcast, we've talked about how many front office team members you need in your office. Last episode, we talked about how many assistants you need in your office. So we're just going to keep that going today and talk about how many dental hygienists do you need in your office? How many hygienists should you have? When I hear that question, it kind of makes me cringe because what I would rather ask, how many well-trained dental hygienists should you have in your office? With hygienists, I think there is one very key thing that you want to look at to figure out how many you should have in your office or when it's time to hire a new one. And we'll talk about that here today. And I also want to give you some examples from the growth of my startup office, which a lot of you and a lot of people who acquire practices don't really see the process of going from 0 to 1, 2, 3 or more hygienists because you might acquire a practice with a few already in place. And so it can be tough to know when that next hire needs to happen or that next move needs to happen. So I want to talk to you about some examples from the growth of my own startup and from some other practices as well. So the number one thing, let's keep it very simple. The number one thing to look at when evaluating how many hygienists to have in your office is how long does it take to get new patients into your schedule? Generally, I think if you're booked out more than, say, 2 weeks for a new patient to get into your schedule on hygiene side, that's probably too long. It's probably time to evaluate how many provider hours, how many hygienists you have in your practice, and is it time to increase that number? But, and this is such a key point in this discussion, if your hygienists are not being productive with their time, if they're not working efficiently, if they're not helping you co-diagnose treatment and spending time with patients talking about potential treatment options, if they're not helping to create a better patient experience in your office and increase treatment acceptance with what they're doing, maybe it's time to look at the performance of your hygiene team before you think about just adding more providers. All too often, I see dentists and practices getting busy. And if you're watching the video podcast, I'm making air quotes here, getting busy on the hygiene side, having trouble fitting new patients in for 2, 3, 4 weeks or longer. And instead of looking at the performance of their team and maybe getting creative with some strategies to get new patients in, they just automatically decide, I need to add a hygienist. That's the only option. And sometimes this occurs when we have multiple hygienists in the practice who are underperforming. They might be taking a long time. It's not uncommon for dentists to acquire a practice with underperforming team members, and the hygiene department is no exception to that. So they might be taking a long time, missing the essentials, doing x-rays when they're needed, talking about fluoride application, all of the things that hygienists should be doing. And instead of having the kind of tough conversation and putting forth the effort to work with team members like this and train them, or if that doesn't work after some time, potentially replacing them, it's almost like something that a lot of people avoid like the plague. And you've heard me say this a gazillion times on the podcast, but if there's something like that in your office that you are dreading doing, it's probably the thing you need to do the most. So let's say you get booked out a few weeks in your practice. Yeah, it might be time to add a hygienist, but are you looking at how productive your current hygiene team is? Maybe per hour, or looking at things that they can do to be more efficient. When we're talking about hygiene productivity, I think it's important to expand on that a little bit as well. I do not believe in cracking the whip. I do not believe in just constantly trying to push production and dollar signs out of your hygienists, decreasing appointment times, adding a bunch of products for them to sell, or pushing and pressuring patients into adjunctive services. That is not the key to a healthy hygiene department in my mind. What a healthy hygiene department looks like from a productivity standpoint is they are doing the things they need to do to be honest with patients, to help them with whatever their needs are. I never want any hygiene team to feel like they have to go through this checklist of, did I try to sell a Sonicare today? Did I talk about whitening? Did I try to do all these little piddly things that would increase the productivity of this appointment today? No, I want them to think like a healthcare provider for the person who is right there in front of them in their chair. What can this patient benefit from? It could be alignment of their teeth and correcting their occlusion. So that might mean they spend a good amount of time while they're cleaning teeth instead of just chit-chatting about the weather, talking about clear aligner therapy, talking about occlusion, talking about the experiences of their other patients with that type of treatment. I have team members in my practice who have gone through clear aligner therapy and they talk about their own experience. Some of them are currently in it. What a great way to talk to patients about something that they could benefit from. They're talking to somebody who's had it done themselves. You've heard us at TLP talk a ton about co-diagnosis. And instead of having your hygienist focus on this little piddly stuff that doesn't really mean anything, why not have them focus on helping you as a team together to take care of patients by talking about the potential issues and potential solutions that they see in their patients' mouths. Obviously, in your hygiene department, you want to make sure that perio is getting diagnosed appropriately, but it's not just as simple as being calibrated on the protocols for going from prophy to scaling and root planing. Are we fully prepared to have a honest and truthful conversation with our patients who have gum disease about how we fix it, what the benefits are, what the consequences are if we ignore it, and working through those questions and discussions with a patient so that when you come into the room as a doctor, you can have the confidence to know that your hygienist and that patient have already talked about these things and they already have an idea of what this could look like to address their gum infection. Those things that I just mentioned, those might not necessarily show up on a production report for a hygienist. They might not necessarily come across in how much they've produced in dollar signs at the end of the month. But I can tell you from experience, both in my practice and the practices of my clients, that is probably the most valuable thing for your practice that a hygienist can be doing is talking and discussing with patients their needed treatment or their potential needed treatment, and looking at them as a person that they're trying to help and not just saying 8 o'clock, clean teeth, talk about flossing and brushing, 9 o'clock, clean teeth, talk about flossing or brushing, 10 o'clock, perio maintenance. Let's talk about the spots on the perio chart where we see a 4s or higher or bleeding. No, that is such a bad rhythm to get into for your hygiene team. And it's really easy to fall into this rhythm, this trap. So it comes down to you as a dentist and a leader of your team to be very clear about what your expectations are and remaining vigilant on that from your hygiene team. Another thing that I see, and I want you all to think about, if you, let's say you're booked out a few weeks and you're thinking about adding a hygienist, is can you do anything on your doctor side to take on the load or some of the load of bringing on new patients into your practice through your chair and not necessarily through the hygiene chair? This comes down to oftentimes to your front desk team being able to triage who is a hygiene focused patient, who is a routine, just had a cleaning 6 months ago and moved into the area type patient, as an example, and who is a my teeth are falling out of my mouth, I have a cracked tooth, I have a huge problem, fix me please type of patient. Those are the two buckets, obviously, that we have a lot of patients fall into. So why would you have the treatment focused urgent needs from a restorative standpoint patient always coming through your hygiene chair? Now, don't get me wrong. In my practice, I love having most new patients come through the hygiene chair because we have a very exact process for the new patient experience. And a lot of the time that involves seeing the hygienist first, going through all of the necessary steps of the new patient appointment and diagnosis before seeing the doctor. But for these types of patients, the cleaning of their teeth might be the least important thing that you need to do for them. I'm not saying gum treatment prophylaxis is not important, but if you've got someone with a mouthful of broken teeth and cavities and they also need a cleaning, but otherwise gums are healthy, what's most important? That's an easy answer. It's not uncommon that I can take a look at a doctor's schedule where they feel like hygiene is booked out too far. And I can pick and choose new patients, especially who are booked in the hygiene chair, who could and probably should be booked in the doctor chair. They've maybe said on their new patient paperwork or told the front desk that they have a chipped tooth, they have multiple chipped teeth, all the things that a new patient might say, where they're restoratively focused. The dentist can be doing the new patient exam, and that patient doesn't need to necessarily see the hygienist at their first visit every single time. Don't be afraid to have some flexibility with how you're bringing in new patients through your practice. Get everybody in your practice involved in this. It's not just a hygiene driven appointment for new patients. It's everyone has a role to play in the office. So to summarize everything so far from our podcast today, my answer to the question, how many well-trained hygienists should you have in your office, is probably enough so that you're not booked out longer than 2 weeks to get a new patient into your hygiene chair. But there's lots of other things to think about besides just that. And when we're answering this question, should I add a hygienist in my practice? Generally, I do feel like we all as dentists wait too long to add more hygienists or more providers into our practice. And why is that? I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of us as dentists, our personalities tend to be risk adverse. We want to do things that are a sure bet often. A lot of the time when adding a hygienist, we're bound to see some more open space in the schedule. We're growing. We don't just go from one full-time hygienist to 2 full-time hygienists instantly and not see maybe a decrease in the busyness of the schedule. I guess you could if you have enough new patients to immediately support that second hygienist, but oftentimes there's some empty space. When it comes to answering this question and deciding if you should add someone in your own practice, I don't know if listening to this podcast is enough to help you make the decision, if talking to a trusted advisor and getting their analysis on the situation is enough. But if I were you and I were thinking about this, I would just do a really honest analysis of the situation in my practice, answering the questions and the bullet points that I've already talked about today in this podcast to really determine if the addition of a provider is going to help you accomplish your goals and is going to help your practice grow if that's what you're looking to do. All too often, we look at decisions like this and we act like those decisions are irreversible or they're all or nothing type decisions. For instance, let's just use this as an example. You have one hygienist in your practice, they're getting pretty busy, and you want to grow your practice. You've got healthy new patient numbers. You think that you can support another part-time or full-time hygienist. You bring that hygienist on into your practice and the economy tanks, or the big employer in town goes out of business and all those patients that you might have potentially seen lose their insurance, aren't potential patients anymore. If that is truly the worst case scenario that we're defining, what can you do to mitigate that risk? You could just go back to one hygienist. That's okay. That's a scenario that is very real. I'm sure it's happened to somebody in their own practice, but it's not the end of the world. It's not great for your business, but it's not the end of the world. So don't be afraid to take a leap of faith every once in a while when it comes to decisions like this. At the end of the day, it's not that big of a decision, especially if you're already running a solid practice. Along those lines, a question I always get is, if I'm growing, let's say I'm going from 1 to 2 hygienists, do I hire somebody part-time initially or do I hire somebody full-time? And when I hear that, it's almost like we want to be perfectly 100% booked in hygiene. So we want to add one more hygiene day and make sure that's perfectly booked. And let's add another day. Make sure that's booked to the max. We never want to see any empty space on our schedule for some reason. Maybe it just makes us feel good. But that's not always a realistic way to hire a highly skilled hygienist or employee. Let's say an A-plus hygienist is out there in your town looking for a job. They probably don't want to just come to your office for 1 day a week. And then whenever you tell them, they'll come in 2 days a week. And then whenever you tell them again, they'll up that to 3 days a week. It's probably not how it works. So you might have to take a leap of faith, hire an A-plus player to work 3-4 days a week and go from 1 full-time hygienist to 2 full-time hygienists very quickly. Sure, your overhead for your staff might go up temporarily. You might have holes in your schedule. You might have to get creative, but more than likely, adding an A-plus player and having room to grow and having room to fit new patients and scaling and route planning patients into your schedule is going to benefit you over time. That's an example of being in growth mode in your practice versus trying to absolutely maximize the profitability. So don't be afraid to think in growth mode when you're answering the question, should I add a hygienist or should I add a provider to my practice? When I talk like this, I certainly haven't always had the solution to this question because I lived through this like analysis paralysis in my startup very early on. I look back and I feel like I was still like a child basically when I did this. But when I started my practice, I was obviously doing hygiene myself from day one, which almost all of us are doing when we're starting practices from scratch. And I hired part-time hygienists here and there initially, but I was just petrified to increase the costs and the overhead associated with the business. I was so focused on low overhead and just so focused on making sure my expenses, the money that went out each month, were so low that I just had no idea how to grow. So after doing this for some time, hiring a temp for one day because the schedule looked busy, and then hiring another one around Christmas time and blah, 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 I finally just woke up and said, I need to hire my first hygienist and hire them full time. And it was a little scary at first because, especially in a startup, you hire somebody full time and all those new patients, all those recalls that made me feel busy using my two hands, they were being seen by somebody else. And for a day or two, kind of was like twiddling my thumbs. But then I realized, oh, I can now do same day treatment. Oh, now I have more time to do dentist things, the things I'm supposed to be doing, high productivity things. And that's when the light bulb went off that I need to have other people. I need to leverage the talents of other people like hygienists to be freed up as a dentist to do dentist things. And in my startup, once that light bulb went off, we had one hygienist. She got busy very quickly with high new patient numbers. It was amazing how quickly we grew to 2 full-time hygienists. That's when things really start to hit their stride, at least in my practice, with our productivity and our growth. Eventually, those 2 hygienists became booked out a few weeks on our 3.5-day schedule. So I hired another. And the one thing I'll say, for those of you who haven't worked with 3 hygienists at one time, that's when I noticed that I really needed to be focused in my exams with my hygienist. It was really easy to take a lot of time and honestly get distracted from my schedule and honestly get burnt out a little bit. So we had to get very intentional with how those hygiene exams went and very focused instead of just going in all laissez-faire whenever the hygienists were ready for us. That was when I started to notice, wow, like hygiene checks can take a lot of my time and a lot of my energy if I'm not careful. And at the same time, I noticed that it was very easy for me when I made the jump from 2 hygienists to 3 to get lazy with my exams. Now, noticing crazed lines or cracks around big honking molar amalgams, but honestly just feeling like, I got to get back to my patients and my schedule. And maybe I won't talk about the crown that tooth really needs, or not really talking about occlusion with patients, not talking about straightening teeth, the type of conversations that take some energy. They take some intentionality and some effort. And I won't call it being lazy. It's just that I felt like I noticed the jump from 2 to 3 hygienists the most as far as the time and the effort that it took to do a good job for exams. So if that sounds like you in your practice, if you ever feel that way when you're doing hygiene exams, just remember that pushing through that feeling and figuring out ways to be, again, more efficient, having well-trained hygienists who can help you co-diagnose so that you don't feel like you're expending as much energy doing their exams is one of the lowest hanging fruit, I'd say, in almost any practice. Eventually, in my practice, we decided we were going to continue to grow. So we went from our 3 or 3.5 day a week schedule to 4 full days of all these hygienists. And honestly, now we're booked out a few weeks and we're ready to grow again. But in practice, if you see that, oh, shoot, we can't get a new patient into the schedule right now for 3 weeks, don't immediately go out and hire a new hygienist. Evaluate those things that we've already talked about today. Don't jump into hiring a new hygienist, whether part or full time, without first looking at their productivity, making sure that they're being efficient with their time, helping you co-diagnose treatment, helping to create a better patient experience and increase treatment acceptance. Make sure that everything is dialed in so that you don't just continue to grow with more people without addressing the inefficiencies or addressing the performance of your team that really matter. So again, answer the question, how many well-trained hygienists do you need on your team? Probably enough to make sure you're not booked out more than a few weeks to see new patients, but think about all this other stuff too. That's the honest answer that I can give to that question. All right, gang. I hope that's helpful to you all. I hope it gives you some things to think about, just like these last few episodes when we're talking about staffing. Here coming up, we might have another kind of bonus episode when talking about staffing. And that podcast could probably be hours long, but we'll try to fit it into one of your typical TLP podcast bite-sized episodes. So we'll see about that. And also going to have an update on my real estate journey. We're going to talk more about real estate here in some of my upcoming episodes here on the podcast. So again, thank you all for listening. I appreciate it more than you know. It is so fun to be reaching you all every few weeks on this podcast. And I know I speak for Derek and Steve when I say that we absolutely love doing it. Go do something amazing in your life and in your practice this week. If you need anything, reach out to me, Matt@thelifestylepractice.com. I hope I can help you become a better dentist and a better business owner and achieve everything you want out of your career as a dentist. So until next time, take care. Cheers.